So, I woke up to the sound of my son listing prices. 600 for the sideboard, but we can say it's antique. The fluorescent lights above buzzed. My throat was dry, my legs stiff. The hospital sheet clung to my skin. I blinked once, then again. That voice wasn't from a nurse. And the ceramic sets? A woman's voice this time. "Janny, my daughter." "Trash," she laughed. "We can dump them or sell as rustic." I couldn't move, but my ears worked just fine. "Jeannie."
Ellen.
Standing somewhere near the foot of my bed. "The realtor says we could list the house by next weekend," Alan said. "List. The house." My fingers twitched. No one noticed. She won't even realize, Janie murmured. Half her mind's already gone. They thought I was unconscious. My mouth was dry, but my brain burned. They were dividing my life, while I was still in it. The window beside my bed showed a tulip field in early bloom. Red-orange, white, vivid and silent. Willem would have smiled at the view. He picked the spot in 1974. We laid each brick. He died in that house. And they were selling it. My heart thumped in my chest. "Heavy? Uneven." Alan's voice again. "We have to move quickly." She might not last the month. Janie didn't object. They were counting me out, like expired milk. A beep went off beside my head. Monitor. My heartbeat was too loud. I turned my head, slow, almost invisible, toward the hallway. No nurse. No Lena. Where was Lena? Where was anyone who gave a damn? "The will still has her name, but we can challenge it," Alan muttered. "If she slips," Janie said, "we can say she was confused." The ceramic bowl on the windowsill. Blue cracked. I made it in 1982. They called it trash. I called it a gift. That bowl held Lena's first pacifier. Willem's watch when he washed the dishes. Now it held silence. I remembered what the neurologist said. The stroke spared her mind. Then why was I being erased? Alan walked to the foot of my bed, shoes tapping tile. Sharp. "We could start moving boxes this week. She won't notice." "We can change the locks," Janie said. "Lock's my home." I wanted to scream. I wanted to sit up and throw that bowl across the room. But all I could do was breathe and listen. And remember, Willem had made me promise something before he died. It came back in pieces now. His hands around mine, clay still under his nails. "If they ever try to take it, you make sure it stays yours. It our house, our story, our work." I blinked again. The air smelled like antiseptic and betrayal. Janie moved closer. I saw the edge of her dress. White linen, expensive. "I'll talk to the lawyer Monday," she said. Alan sighed. "She won't even understand." I understood plenty. The heart monitor beeped again. They left the room. Finally, I exhaled. Slow, measured. The way Willem used to teach me when I got nervous before parent-teacher conferences. Breathe through the pain, not around it. I had no voice? Not yet. But I still had memory. And I remembered something else. The key, the safe, the letter. Alan and Janie thought they knew everything. But they didn't know what Willem and I signed in 2011. They didn't know the house wasn't mine to give. And it sure as hell wasn't theirs to take. The house smelled like wet clay and fresh tulips. It always did in the spring. Back in 1974, we didn't have much. Just a plot of land Willem found on a drive, a borrowed cement mixer, and 2 aching backs full of hope. He had pointed to the corner where the kitchen would be. "That's where you'll make coffee, with sunlight pouring through the east window." I laughed. "And where will you put your kiln?" He pointed behind the garage. "That shed will build last, after everything else is done." That was Willem. Always thinking 10 steps ahead, but only after I smiled first. We built the walls ourselves, one cinder block at a time, poured foundation on weekends, ate peanut butter on bread while waiting for concrete to dry. I still remember the first fire in the fireplace. We didn't even have curtains yet, just each other and the soft sound of pine crackling. "This is ours," he said, his voice a whisper behind my ear. That was the moment I knew I'd never leave. We filled that house with memory. Morning coffee in chipped mugs, Willem's muddy boots by the door, my students' drawings taped to the fridge, Lena's first birthday, the cake lopsided, frosting everywhere. We didn't buy things, we made them. We kept what mattered. In 2011, after Willem got his diagnosis, he grew quieter. One morning, I found him on the porch, staring out at the tulips. "I want to protect you," he said, "while I still can." He handed me a folder. inside legal documents I didn't understand. A trust, he explained. The house will belong to the Ellingsen Foundation. You'll be its trustee. They won't be able to touch it without going through you. But it's our home, I whispered. He nodded. And I don't trust our children with it. That hurt. But I understood. Even then, Alan was already pushing for renovations. Janie had floated the idea of selling and moving me to assisted living. Willem saw it coming. Before I did, he made me promise. No matter what they say, you keep the house? It's your story? So I did, even when the stroke knocked me down. Even when they stopped visiting for birthdays. Even when they pretended I was half alive. I held that memory close. That's why I kept teaching until 68. That's why I took care of the tulips alone each spring. That's why I never changed the kitchen tile, even when it cracked. Because Willem's fingerprints were in that grout, and mine, and now they wanted to wipe it all clean. But I still had the folder. I still had the deed. And if my hands could not fight, my memory would. I heard the tear before I saw it. A sharp rip. Thick paper splitting in two. Then Janie's voice. This picture is ancient. Why would anyone keep this? I turned my head, slowly. My neck still ached from the therapy session. Alan stood by the dresser, arms crossed. Jeannie held a photo in her hands. No half a photo now. The other half fluttered to the floor. My wedding picture. Willem's eyes cropped out. God, Mom keeps everything, she muttered. That's why we're doing this? Alan replied. She never lets go. She doesn't know what's worth anything anymore. The pieces of my life lay on the floor like crumbs. They had come to clean. Their version of cleaning meant stripping away everything that made me. Me. My classroom plaques, my ceramic bowls from decades of teaching art. The framed sketch Willem did of Lena when she was 5. Gone, packed, or tossed. I mean, look at this, Janie said, holding up a small clay figure. The boy with the crooked hat. A project from a student named Ely. He had trouble speaking, but he made that for me the week his father died. Janie laughed. This is junk. Why would she keep junk? She thinks it's sentimental,
Alan said.
but it's clutter. No resale value, then trash it. I closed my eyes, not to sleep, not to rest, but to try not to cry. The nurse had just adjusted my IV. I wanted to scream. Get them out of here. But I couldn't raise my voice. Not yet. So I listened. And every word they said felt like vinegar in my veins. I say we donate most of the furniture, Alan said. The house'll sell better that way. Janie hesitated. Wait, do we even have rights to do that? There was a silence. Then Alan said carefully, if she signs the papers today, we will. Today, my eyes shot open. They walked toward the window, toward the bowl. My blue and white ceramic bowl. The one from 1982. The one I placed there myself when I arrived. Just days after the stroke. Lena had brought it. I watched as Janie picked it up, fingers curling under the lip. I don't even know what this is, she said. Just toss it. A pause. Or Goodwill. Some old folks like this vintage stuff. I wanted to scream. Instead, my heart gave a tight, angry thump. They walked past my chair, not even glancing at me. Alan stopped. He looked at a framed picture by the rehab bed. The one of me holding newborn Lena. You think she remembers any of this? Janie shrugged. Not really. The doctor said her memory's intact but fragile. Whatever that means. Then she smirked. You think she even knows we're here? I blinked. Hard. That's when Alan said it. The sentence that snapped something in me. Maybe it's time to talk to Sunrise Ridge. They've got a memory care unit. My blood went cold. Sunrise Ridge? Assisted living? I'd toured that place once. The smell of boiled carrots and bleach never left me. No, Willem had said. Never that place? And now, my own children thought I belonged there. With strangers, locked rooms. A bracelet that beeps if you wander too far. My fingers dug into the blanket. They didn't notice. They had never asked if I wanted to leave my home. They had never once said, Mom, what do you want? They had already decided. Jeannie held up another photo. This time, the three of us. Ellen, her and me. At Lena's graduation, she smiled, then dropped it face down into a plastic bin labeled, Sore 2. Alan chuckled. Let's just get this over with before the old woman wakes up. I was awake, fully. Every cell in my body buzzed with rage. And something else. Resolve. The kind that doesn't scream. It whispers. It waits. Jeannie turned, startled. Maybe I'd moved. Maybe I blinked too hard. Her eyes narrowed. Did she? Alan dismissed it. She's twitching again, that's normal. She looked at me like I was furniture. No. Worse. An old coat in the back of a closet, forgotten until inconvenient. She'll forget everything soon, Janie said. Then they left. And the silence returned. Except it wasn't silence. It was memory. It was Willem's voice in my ear. Don't let them take what's yours. And Lena's voice. Soft, true, on her last visit? I know they're trying something. Grandma, I'll be back soon. Yes, she would. And when she did, I would be ready. The clipboard scraped against the metal bed rail. Alan's voice was cheerful, too cheerful.
Hey, Mom.
Brought some forms for you to sign. I turned slowly. My arms worked now. My fingers, too. But I let them hang still. He took that as approval. Just some updates. Insurance stuff. Basic paperwork. He sat down beside me, crossing his legs. Jeans too tight. That cologne he liked. Synthetic citrus. Choked the air. He clicked a pen. I looked down. 3 pages. Legalese in fine print. Signature lines highlighted in yellow. Don't worry about reading it all, he said, smiling. Janie had her friend look it over. Her friend. The one who almost went to law school. He placed the pen in my hand. My fingers curled around it, then stopped. Alan leaned in. Mom, it's just a formality. Trust me, formality. Like a handshake before a shove. I moved my thumb slightly. Not signing, just feeling the weight. He took it as progress. The sooner we handle this, the sooner you can focus on healing. That's when I heard Johnny enter. She was always louder in heels. Is she signing yet? Alan turned, hopeful. She's holding the pen. Janie walked over. Plucked the clipboard from his lap. It's just power of attorney stuff, she told me, too brightly. Standard. We'll take care of things while you rest. Rest? My eyes drifted to the edge of the papers. One line caught my eye. Authorization to manage access or transfer accounts. Signatory fully consents. No, my grip loosened. The pen dropped. Alan frowned. Come on, Mom. Don't make this harder than it needs to be. Janie rolled her eyes. She doesn't even know what she's holding. She was wrong. I knew exactly what they were asking. They wanted my silence, my signature, my surrender. A nurse knocked, stepped in. Vettel's check. Saved by the blood pressure cuff. Alan exhaled. We'll come back later. He gathered the forms like they were worthless scraps. Except they weren't. They were keys to everything Willem and I had built. They left without saying goodbye. Later that afternoon, Lena arrived. She brought me a soft ginger cookie in warm hands. Grandma? She whispered. They're trying to move money, did you know? I blinked. She reached into her backpack, a printed email. Janie forwarding something to a bank contact. Janie used your name to request a balance sheet. It got copied to me by accident. She must have typed the wrong email. I stared at the numbers, one of the accounts Willem and I had shared, the one with 23,000. Now it showed 2,745 gone. Lena's eyes filled. I knew something was wrong. I squeezed her hand, weak, but firm. She understood. They think you can't fight, she said. But they're wrong. Yes, they were. The next day the doctor came in, a younger man, nervous eyes. Clipboard always close. He checked my chart, then hesitated. Mrs. Ellingsen, he said slowly. I was approached by your children. They asked about your cognitive capacity. I stared at him. He shifted. They were, wondering if a declaration of diminished competence might apply. He said it fast, like ripping off a bandage. My jaw didn't move. But inside, my mind screamed. He cleared his throat. I told them your mind is sharp. You're aware. You're processing. You just need physical time. Good. He didn't lie for them, but they were already laying tracks, declaring me unfit, to take, to sell, to erase. That night, I asked the nurse 2 blinks for phone. She brought it, placed it in my palm. I dialed slowly. Not Alan, not Johnny. Harold, Willem's best friend. Our family lawyer. His voice answered on the 3rd ring. Ellingsen residence. I blinked. Then pressed the receiver to my cheek. Silence on my end. But he knew. Martha. A pause. You don't need to talk. Just listen. If you need help, tap twice. I did. 2 taps? I'll be there by Thursday, he said. Don't sign anything. I smiled. For the first time in days, they thought I was fading. But I was documenting. And Thursday was coming. They didn't come back on Thursday. Not Friday either. By Saturday, the nurses stopped asking if I was expecting visitors. Alan's cologne scent never returned. Jeannie's sharp heels never echoed in the hallway. Just silence. And soup. The kind they wheel in covered with foil. Lukewarm, smelling like something between cardboard and celery. I ate slowly. Not from hunger, but for something to do. Outside, the tulips were blooming too fast. It should have made me smile. It didn't. Invisibility is not sudden. It seeps in like damp air. First, they forget to call. Then they forget your voice. Then you start forgetting what it felt like to be needed. I pressed the nurse call button once. She came 10 minutes later, breathless. Sorry, short staff today? She didn't make eye contact. She adjusted my blanket. Left? No questions. No, how are you? The worst part. I stopped expecting it. On Sunday, a church group came to visit the floor. Teenagers with acoustic guitars. They sang Amazing Grace. I closed my eyes, not from peace, but to hide the sting. One girl, maybe 16, touched my arm and whispered, "God loves you?" I nodded. But in that moment, I wasn't sure if anyone else did. Lena came Monday, with tea and cookies wrapped in wax paper. She brought me a new set of pens and a blank notebook. You always liked writing, she said. I hadn't picked up a pen in weeks, but I squeezed her hand. Twice her eyes misted. I know. She stayed an hour, read me the news, told me about a class she was taking on justice and ethics. I think of you a lot during it, she said. When she left, she kissed my cheek. Whispered, I'll be back Thursday, I promise. Her promises were the only ones I trusted now. Tuesday, I stared at the ceiling too long. The nurse asked if I wanted the TV on. I blinked once. No, the world outside was already too noisy. Inside, I needed quiet. To think. To remember to rebuild. I started writing in the notebook Wednesday. Slowly, shakily. My hand didn't always cooperate, but the words came, like birds returning after winter. I am not gone. I am still here. This is my story. Each line steadied me. Each letter gave me back a piece of myself. By Thursday, the nurses said I seemed stronger. I asked for a mirror. My face startled me, thin, creased, but my eyes, alive. I wrote that down too. Wise, don't forget. Harold arrived late afternoon, dressed in his usual flannel and khakis like he never aged. He held up the trust folder. Still sealed, he said. He sat beside me, opened the papers slowly. We can freeze the accounts, block any access attempts. You're still trustee, and no one, not even family, can touch the deed. I blinked. Relief. Then another blink. Grief, not for the money, for what I thought family meant. He waited. Let me breathe. Then said, We'll begin the filings Friday. Quietly. You don't owe them notice. Quiet justice. I wrote that phrase down later. Underlined it. That night a nurse wheeled in someone new to the room beside mine. An older woman, confused, crying for her daughter. I lay there listening, then reached for my notebook. Wrote, I am not her. Not yet. Not ever. Unless I let them. I underlined that too. Twice. Friday morning I asked for coffee. Black. They brought it weak. But it was mine. I sipped slowly. Stared out at the tulips. The wind shifted, and for the first time in weeks, I felt like the earth hadn't forgotten me. The car ride felt foreign. After weeks of rehab walls and antiseptic sheets, the smell of leather and wind through cracked windows was a kind of shock. Alan didn't speak much. Jeannie sat in the passenger seat, scrolling through her phone. No music, no welcome home smiles, just a quick comment. Only a few hours. Don't overdo it. They didn't bring flowers or ask how I felt. They needed a warm body to complete a picture. That's all. The driveway looked the same, but the flowers were gone. My tulips, dug up, replaced with gravel. Janie stepped out first. Be careful on the walkway, she said. We just had it redone. Can't afford a fall. Can't afford. Not. Would care if you get hurt. Alan helped me out of the car, barely. He didn't offer his arm, just hovered. The front door opened. People inside, Lauder? Clinking glasses. Jenny turned to me. Try not to talk too much, okay? Then pushed open the door. The living room was full. Neighbors, some of Willem's old colleagues. A cake on the table read, "Welcome back, kind off." In cheap blue frosting, Janny clapped. "Look who made it." Some turned, some didn't. Polite nods, tight smiles. No one hugged me. A few said, "So glad you're out of the hospital." But not one said, "We missed you." The air smelled of shrimp cocktail and potpourri. Janny leaned toward me. "Could you go get the plates?" Kitchen cabinet above the sink. She didn't wait for my answer. She moved to the wine table. I stood there, in my own home. An afterthought, the woman who made that kitchen with her bare hands. Now reduced to hostess duties, I walked slowly. Every step echoed. Not a soul offered help. The kitchen was pristine. Too pristine. My old magnets gone from the fridge. The corkboard with Lina's drawings gone. Replaced with a whiteboard that read, "Groceries only organic. No sodium. No junk." I opened the cabinet. Found the plates. Each one felt heavier than I remembered. By the time I returned, the room had shifted. Someone was giving a toast. Alan stood tall, puffed up. "We're grateful for Mom's recovery and that she's able to join us briefly before transitioning to a safer long-term option." Laughter. Not from joy, from awkwardness. I froze. Safer long-term option. He was already telling people I wouldn't be staying. That this was temporary. That I didn't belong here anymore. I placed the plates on the table. No one clapped. No one thanked me. "Mom, could you cut the cake?" Jeannie called. "Careful with the knife?" I walked to the cake, held the plastic handle. The words blurred. "Welcome back, kind off." What did that even mean? I sliced, one by one, silent. Jeannie handed out the pieces. Alan poured champagne. "To new beginnings," he toasted. Another wave of polite clinks. No one looked my way. Then Lena stepped forward, her voice calm, clear. "I'd like to make a toast, too." Alan blinked. "Sure, honey." She raised her glass. "Here's to grandmothers who built this house, brick by brick. Who taught us to see art in broken bowls. And who never stopped loving, even when the people they loved forgot how to return it." Silence. Someone coughed. Janny went pale. Alan shifted his feet. Lena sipped her drink, put the glass down, then kissed my cheek. "Welcome home, Grandma." That was the first time anyone said it. And meant it. I didn't cry, not in front of them. But I held the knife tighter. Not from anger. From control. From the slow, steady reclaiming of who I was. Let them laugh. Let them whisper. They didn't know what Lennon and I knew. Justice was coming, and it would not need cake or applause. It would arrive silently, like dignity, and stay. Rain tapped the window softly, not a storm. Just that steady kind of Oregon drizzle that seeps into bone and thought. Lena helped me into her car. "Janie and Alan are out for the weekend," she said. "Corporate retreat. You've got 4 hours?" I nodded. "No words needed." She handed me gloves. "Dust everywhere," she smirked. "You ready?" As ready as I'd ever be. The house was quiet. The quiet felt different this time. Not lonely. Not humiliating. It felt mine. We entered through the back door, the one Willem always used. Lena kept watch by the porch. I moved slowly. Not from weakness. From reverence. Every step in that house mattered. Every memory still lived. I opened the hall closet. Felt around behind the coats. There it was. A tiny key taped under the second shelf. Willem never trusted electronics, mechanical, reliable. That's what he always said. The attic door creaked. Dust spun in the slanted light. I climbed slowly, each step a whisper of the past. Boxes labeled with Willem's handwriting lined the walls. I moved toward the far corner, lifted the old rug. There it was. The safe. Brown, dented, stubborn. I inserted the key. Turned, it clicked open like it never forgot me. Inside, a leather folder with the Ellingsen Foundation seal. The Willem's will. A letter with my name written in his handwriting. 2 large envelopes marked. In case they try something. My hands shook. Not from fear. From knowing I was about to remember who I was. I opened the first envelope. Inside the trust papers. Dated 2011. Signed by Willem, notarized clear. The property title had been moved to the foundation. And I was sole trustee. It meant the house wasn't theirs to sell. Not legally. Not morally. Not ever. The second envelope held bank printouts. Willem's notes scribbled on margins. "Keep separate. Do not let Alan near this." He knew. He always knew. Then I opened the letter. Dearest M, if you're reading this, something's happened. And I'm not around to glare down Alan myself. You were always the one who believed the best in people. That's what I loved most. But I saw this coming. So I set up safeguards. Not because I doubted you, because I doubted them. Hold your ground. Use the papers. Let the house speak for itself. I love you. Always W. I folded it carefully, placed it in my coat pocket, and for the first time in months, I didn't feel alone. Lena called softly from below. 10 minutes? I nodded. Almost done. On a lower shelf of the safe, something else caught my eye. A file folder marked Insurance 2022. I opened it. There it was. A document authorizing access to my health account. But something was off. The signature. It was my name. But not my writing, Janny. She had copied my name. I checked the dates. It was filed in June 2022, when I was still recovering from pneumonia. Janny had forged my name, accessed funds, and redirected payments to a new caregiver provider. Not Lena. Not anyone I knew. The name matched a Shell LLC Alan had once mentioned over dinner. Just a little real estate side hustle. They'd funneled money through my name, disguised as care. I inhaled slowly, the kind of inhale Willem taught me, controlled, measured. I placed the folder back in the safe. Then thought twice. I took pictures. Every page. Lena peeked in. Need help? No, I whispered. My voice came back. She smiled. As we drove away, I watched the house fade in the side mirror. Not with sadness, with clarity. That was my story, my husband's story? Our legacy. And they had tried to erase it. But now I had everything. The truth, the proof, and most importantly, time. Because quiet justice doesn't need a spotlight. It just needs patience. And I had plenty of that left. I stopped sleeping. Not from fear, from clarity. Every time I closed my eyes, the documents replayed in my mind. The trust, Willem's letter, Jeannie's forged signature, the proof, the betrayal, the silence of it all. It echoed. At night, the hall light from the rehab center spilled under my door. It created a faint strip across the linoleum floor, flickering when the nurses changed shifts. That was when I thought the hardest.
What now?
What would Willem have done? Some things don't need noise. He used to say, just timing. I whispered that to myself like prayer. Just timing. On the fourth night, I asked for tea at 2 a.m. The nurse looked surprised. Chamomile? I blinked. She smiled. Coming up. Warmth returned with that cup. Steam curled gently into the room. The scent reminded me of Willem's nightstand mug, forever stained with tea and time. I stared at the ceiling and began to list the steps. Freeze joint accounts, notify lawyer of fraudulent access, review house deed updates, revoke all medical proxies signed after 2021. Every plan written in my head, not on paper. Not yet. They couldn't know. Not until it was done. Lena visited Thursday. Brought a new scarf, sage green, soft, warrior color, she said. I smiled. She noticed the bags under my eyes. No sleep. I shook my head. You're building something, aren't you? I looked at her. She held my gaze. I can feel it, she whispered.
It's quiet.
But strong.
I took her hand.
2 squeezes. She leaned in. I'll keep them distracted. Just give me the signal. The next night I wrote. Pages and pages in the notebook she gave me. Not just plans, thoughts, memories. What it felt like to hold Willem's hand on the porch swing. The scent of pine after summer rain. The time Alan scraped his knee and cried for hours. How I held him. The letter Gianni wrote in 5th grade. Mom, I love your laugh. So much love had existed once. Where did it go? Did betrayal always come dressed as silence? Or was it born slowly, in rooms where no one asked you how you felt? By Sunday, I had made a decision. No confrontation, no scene, just action. And timing. I asked the nurse for access to a notary. She blinked. You're very sharp, you know that? I nodded. I'll call in a favor, she said.
Monday.
A man with a briefcase arrived. He didn't wear a tie, didn't ask questions. Just notarized the letter I'd written, revoking all financial and medical permissions granted to Alan and Janny. Appointing Harold as sole executor, granting Lena secondary access. The pen trembled in my hand, but the signature was mine, fully mine.
Not Fort-pressured mine. That night I slept.
Truly slept, for 6 full hours, and dreamed of tulips. Not dug up, but blooming, vibrant, stubborn, free. The morning fog hadn't lifted, but I had. Harold arrived at the rehab center in his usual flannel. His folder was thicker than last time. "I took care of the accounts," he said. "Calm. Efficient. All access now flows through the Foundation Trust. No movement without your signature." He didn't have to explain further. I understood. My children no longer held the reins to my life. He pulled out a second set of documents. "The health proxy is void. Your new healthcare directive is filed. Legally airtight." I stared at the pages, clean, precise, power in print. "They won't know until it's too late," Harold added quietly. I nodded, throat thick. It was the only moment of the day I allowed myself to feel the weight of it all. Everything they had done, without asking, without care, was finally being undone, not with rage, with resolve. Lena appeared that afternoon, cheeks red from the wind. She wheeled in a small suitcase, pretending it was filled with clothes. "Inside," she whispered, "is your real inheritance, my journals, family albums, the guest book from our 40th anniversary." Janie had once told me a leak had ruined everything, but Lena had found them. Not damaged, just discarded. That truth hit harder than I expected. I waited until she left to open them. One page at a time, memories returned slowly. Smiles from birthdays, little scribbles in the margins, my handwriting across the years. I had written about my fears, my exhaustion, my pride in my children, my gratitude for Willem's steady love. Now those pages reminded me I had always been present. I had always given everything. And they had chosen to forget. I couldn't forget. Not now. Not when justice was within reach. I made a list in my notebook that night. Freeze joint accounts. Remove Gianni and Alan from legal access. Reinstate Harold as executor. Protect the house permanently. Every item brought clarity, each tick a quiet reclaiming. The next morning, I called the bank. Spoke directly to a manager. "My name is Martha Ellingsen," I said. "I'd like to remove all secondary access from my personal and joint accounts." The line was quiet for a moment. Then a professional but kind voice replied, "We'll begin that process right now, Ms. Ellingsen." There was no disbelief in her tone, no hesitation. She didn't see me as a burden. Just a client, a person with control. That simple act of being heard, that was healing too. Harold returned Thursday. He brought a courier packet. Inside the final property transfer, the house was now fully under the Ellingsen Art Education Fund. No future owner, not even a relative, could alter the deed without my trustee's signature. I held the pen in my hand for a long time before signing. The house had once been my gift to the family. Now it was my statement. They would not erase me from it. I signed, not for revenge, for remembrance. That afternoon, Lena came back with one last box. "This was buried behind the garage tools," she said. "Inside were my ceramic pieces, my bowls, my mugs, glazed with care, fired with patience." Janie had called them junk, but here they were. Lena unwrapped each one like a relic. "These belong in a gallery," she said. I held one cracked plate in my hands and felt tears sting. "I made this for Willem's birthday in '93, I whispered. "Then it's priceless," she replied. We sat with them for hours, saying nothing, letting the art speak. There was one more detail I had to handle. Janie's forged insurance forms. Harold submitted them to the oversight committee, along with the bank statements. Turns out, the so-called caregiver service they paid from my account. It was just a front. A shell entity registered to a P.O. box in town. A P.O. box linked to Alan's real estate office. No staff, no license, just theft. Legal consequences would come. But quietly. That's how I wanted it. No spectacle. Just correction. By Friday, I stood by the window in my room and looked out at the tulips. The buds were emerging, not open yet, but reaching. Just like me. Reaching back into the world, with roots, with quiet power. I was no longer waiting for justice. I was living it. Every boundary I restored, every object I reclaimed, every signature I rewrote. It was my way of telling the world I never left. They just stopped looking. But I was always here. And now they'd see it again, whether they were ready or not. The morning sky was pale and dry. A strange calm had settled over everything. Even the wind felt like it was holding its breath. Harold stood beside me, "I ask you, holding a legal folder tight to his chest. "You sure you're ready?" he asked. I nodded. Didn't blink. Didn't flinch. It wasn't nerves, it was time. Across town, Janie was slipping into her tailored blue jacket, the one she always wore when she wanted to look professional. Alan had printed the sale documents the night before, even underlining key figures in neon pink. They were proud of the deal. 1,842,000, cash buyer, no inspections. Everything was moving fast, just the way they liked it. Janie called it streamlined. I called it rushed. Because when you rush, you miss things. Like whose name is on the deed. I waited in the corner of Harold's downtown office. It smelled of wood polish and old leather. The walls were lined with legal books Willem once flipped through on rainy afternoons. I ran my fingers along a spine. Property lot 1999. How many nights had he spent reading just to protect us? He would have liked this moment. Would have worn that awful brown tie with the crooked stripe. Would have folded his hands and said nothing until the last page. Harold adjusted the clock on the credenza. 10 more minutes. I nodded again. He didn't try to fill the silence. Didn't need to. Outside the window, spring was blooming early. The dogwoods had started to open. Little pink explosions against the blue. My heart was steady. No adrenaline, just the slow, precise rhythm of dignity returning. At 10:58, the door clicked open. Voices followed. Janie's too loud laugh. Alan's quick footsteps. He entered first, folders in hand. Janie behind, eyes already scanning the room. They didn't see me at first. I stayed seated, back to the wall. Harold greeted them evenly. "Morning. You're right on time." Alan smirked. "Of course." Got everything lined up. He patted the stack of papers. "Let's finalize this sale and get Mom into something more manageable." His words hung in the air. Harold's expression didn't change. I didn't move. But inside me, a quiet wind had begun to rise, and it was about to change everything. Alan opened his folder, pulling out the contracts like a magician ready for his trick. "Here's the buyer agreement. Cash. Closing in 10 days, he said, sliding the document across Harold's desk. Janie leaned forward, chin high. "The notary will be here at noon. We can get the deed signed in under 30. Harold didn't touch the paper. Instead, he reached slowly for a different folder, one with gold trim, one Jeannie hadn't seen before. He laid it down carefully, like it might hum. Alan blinked. "What's that?" Harold opened it. Page 1 Trust Agreement, Ellingsen Art Education Fund. Page 2 Property Deed assigned January 3, 2023. Page 3 Healthcare Proxy Revocation. Each stamped, signed, filed. All decisions regarding the property. Harold said slowly, "Now go through the foundation. Mrs. Ellingsen is sole trustee." Janie's smile cracked. "That's not." She reached for the deed. "Read it." Again. Alan stared. His fingers curled around his pen. That can't be right. We had control. We had. Harold didn't blink. "You lost it months ago." Quietly, legally, completely, Janie stood. "You can't just." Harold raised a hand. "No drama, please. This is not a courtroom. It's a correction." Alan looked at Martha. Finally, like he remembered she was still alive. Still thinking, still capable, his mouth open, closed. "Why?" he asked, almost whispering. Martha folded her hands in her lap, looked him straight in the eye. "You made plans without me. No accusation, just a fact. You signed papers I never saw." Called it care. But it was control. Janie's jaw clenched. Martha continued. "I didn't shout. I just remembered who I was." Silence, only the clock ticking. Harold stood. "If you have no further business, I'll ask you to leave." Alan's hands trembled as he gathered his papers. Janie didn't speak. Didn't even look at Martha. She walked out stiffly, like every step cracked something. Alan followed, but before the door closed, he turned. "Is this what you call love?" Martha didn't flinch. "No, this is what I call a boundary." Then the door clicked shut. Justice had no applause. Only a chair, a window, and silence. And Martha sat in all three. The door closed with a soft click, the kind of sound that used to go unnoticed. But now it felt final. Harold exhaled slowly. He loosened his tie and sat back in his chair. "Do you want tea?" he asked, not looking at me. I shook my head. "Not yet." The silence returned. But it wasn't sharp anymore. It wrapped around the room like an old quilt. "Are you all right?" he asked. I didn't answer right away.
I stood.
Walked toward the window. Outside, the dogwood swayed in a breeze I couldn't hear. But I could feel it in my chest. "I don't feel angry," I said at last. Harold nodded slowly. "That's a sign it worked." I turned to him. "What now?" He raised his eyebrows. "You tell me." I sat again, laid my hands on the polished wood of his desk. Willem once ran his fingers along this same grain.
"You know, I began."
"I don't think I ever wanted to fight them." "I believe you. I just didn't want to disappear." He didn't answer. Didn't need to. The papers had spoken for me. "I think I'd like to start something," I said. "Something?" "A scholarship, maybe." "Art education." In Willem's name. He smiled. "You already did. Now you just have to name it." I closed my eyes for a moment. Saw the glint of my kiln, the rows of dusty brushes, the girl who stayed late to finish her sculpture in 2007. "Ellingsen Legacy Studio," I said. Harold leaned back. "It suits you." We didn't talk much after that. He gathered the folders, filed away the last remnants of what had been attempted, and failed. I stood and walked toward the door. My cane tapped lightly across the floor. At the threshold, I paused. "Thank you," I said. He looked up. "For everything. For treating me like I'd never stopped being capable." He nodded. "Because you hadn't." I stepped outside. The breeze caught the edge of my coat. The city hummed softly around me. But inside was still, not because the storm had passed, but because I had decided how the story ends. With quiet, with clarity, with me holding the pen again. No calls came the next day, or the one after. Alan and Janny disappeared into silence. Not the kind I once feared, but the kind I could finally live with. No apology, no message, no knock on the door. They simply vanished from the story they tried to write me out of. And I didn't chase them. I didn't wait. By the end of the week, my discharge papers were ready. I sat in the hallway as a nurse read through instructions about medication and walking aids. "You have someone picking you up?" she asked. "Yes." Lena appeared with her old red station wagon, the one with cracked leather seats and a thermos always rattling in the back. We didn't say much on the ride. The wind through the windows did the talking. I didn't go back to the house. Not because I couldn't, because I didn't want to. That chapter was closed. Instead, I stayed in Lena's guest room. A twin bed, cream walls, a crocheted throw blanket that smelled like lavender and age. I slept without waking for the first time in weeks, and when I opened my eyes, it was to the sound of birds. Not footsteps in the hallway, not whispered plans, just birds and quiet. Lena left me alone when I needed it. But every morning, there was coffee on the table, always hot, always poured into one of my old handmade mugs. She had kept them all, even the chipped ones, especially the chipped ones. "That's where the stories live," she said once, tapping the crack in the glaze. She was right. 3 days after I moved in, the doorbell rang. Lena answered. "It's Emily," she whispered. My heart startled, then stilled. I nodded. Let her in. She looked taller than I remembered. Older, not in years, but in presence. She held a small plant, succulent ceramic pot, no card. "I just wanted to see how you were doing," she said. I motioned for her to sit. She didn't ask about her parents, didn't defend them, didn't need to. She talked about her new classes, her favorite professor, a gallery show she'd visited with friends. She said, "You would have loved the clay pieces." We talked for 2 hours. It felt like 5 minutes. When she stood to leave, she hugged me. Tight, no words. Then whispered, "I'm proud of you." I didn't cry. Not until she was gone. That night, I sat on the porch with Lena. She poured 2 fingers of whiskey into mismatched glasses. "To survival?" she offered. I shook my head. "To stillness," I corrected. We clinked, drank, stars blinked awake above us. A fox crossed the lawn. Somewhere a dog barked twice and gave up. "I think I want to move," I said. Lena looked sideways. Far, not distance, just direction. The next day, I found myself reaching for a notebook, not for lists, not for lawyers, just a page, a blank one. I wrote, "The silence doesn't hurt anymore. It holds me. I am not what they tried to reduce. I am more." I am rebuilding, not in spite of, but because of. And that night I slept again. Not to escape, but to dream. For the first time in years, the fog was softer in Skagit Valley. Not thick, not heavy, just enough to hold the light in place. I rented a small cottage 2 miles outside town. Wooden floors that creaked in familiar tones. A porch swing, a stove that groaned when it warmed up. Lena helped carry the boxes from the van. Mostly books. Some pottery. 2 photo albums. I didn't bring everything. Just what still felt like mine. The library was a converted toolshed on the edge of the property. Willem once said it had good bones. Now it had shelves, painted in soft green. A sign hung above the door, Ellingsen Reading Room. I didn't advertise. Didn't post about it online. But word spread. A mother came with her daughter, a retired welder who loved mystery novels, a teenager who asked if we had poetry. We did. We always would. Every morning, I unlocked the door, let the light in, dusted the spines, lit a candle by the window. I didn't explain why. It just felt like presence. Some afternoons, I'd read aloud to no one, just to hear story return to the air. Sometimes Lena joined me. She brought coffee, new bookmarks, cookies shaped like flowers. She didn't speak much while I read. She just listened and smiled. One Thursday, the gate creaked. I looked up from my chair, Emily. Hair tied back, backpack slung low. She didn't knock, just entered, ran her hand along the nearest shelf. You did it, she said. I nodded. She found the poetry section, sat cross-legged on the floor. We didn't rush. The clock ticked like a friend. After a while, she stood. Would you ever need help running this? I raised an eyebrow. Why? She smiled soft. Because I want to be part of something that heals. I didn't answer right away. Just pulled out a second chair and left it empty. But waiting, Emily returned the next day, and the next. Soon it became routine. She brought her laptop, helped organize the lending cards, repainted 2 shelves, cataloged the poetry by region. Together we dusted the corners. I taught her how to mend old bindings with thread and patience. She taught me how to set up an email list. We called it Thursday Light, just 1 book recommendation a week. Just 1 voice. But it reached farther than I expected. One morning, a small envelope arrived. No return address. Just a handwritten note on thick paper. Dear Mrs. Ellingsen, I visited your reading room last week while passing through. I didn't introduce myself. I was shy. But your quiet space reminded me of my mother. She lives in a care facility and had stopped speaking much. I brought her one of your bookmarks. She smiled. Yesterday, she spoke for the first time in weeks. Just 1 word, a story, thank you. A daughter who remembers. I sat with that letter for an hour. Didn't move. Didn't cry. Just breathed. Because it had always been about that. Being remembered. Being heard. That night, Emily and I sat under the string lights we'd hung between 2 trees. She read while I scribbled. 1 sentence, then another. I was writing again. Not lists. Not records. But something of mine. The first line of the memoir I never thought I'd live to begin. I was never truly invisible. They just stopped looking. Emily peeked over. That's powerful. I smiled. I'm just getting started. The wind shifted. A single page fluttered. And somewhere deep inside me, the silence turned into voice. Maybe you've been where I was. Maybe you've given too much, stayed too quiet, waited too long. Or maybe someone told you that your time had passed. But I want you to hear this, it hasn't. If you've ever felt erased by your own family, if you've watched your sacrifices vanish into silence, you're not alone. I reclaimed my voice at 70, too. You can, too. Share this story with someone who needs to remember their worth. Leave a comment. Tell me where you're watching from. Tell me what you would have done in my place. Because healing doesn't happen in isolation. It happens when we speak, when we listen, and when we begin. Again.